When you think about old libraries, you might picture dusty shelves and quiet rooms. But sometimes when you see pictures of really old libraries, you notice something strange. Books are chained to the desks. It looks odd to us now, maybe even a bit harsh, but there was a very good reason for it back then. It wasn't about being mean or controlling. It was about protecting something incredibly precious. Imagine a world where books were not common. They weren't like they are today, where you can buy a paperback for a few dollars or read one on your phone. Back then, a book was a treasure, a work of art, and a huge investment of time and money. Understanding why they were chained means understanding just how valuable books used to be. It's a story of knowledge, craftsmanship, and the early days of sharing information. Let's go way back, long before printing presses, even before paper was common in Europe. We're talking about a time when every single book was made by hand, and I mean every single page. This wasn't a quick process. It took months, sometimes years, to create one book. Think about the materials first. Most early books, especially the really important ones, weren't made on paper. They were made on parchment or vellum. These are materials made from animal skins, usually sheep, calf, or goat. Making these skins ready to write on was a big job. The skin had to be cleaned, stretched, scraped thin, and then smoothed until it was just right. It had to be durable and able to hold ink without it bleeding, and it wasn't cheap. You needed many animals just for one book, especially a big one. Then came the scribes. These were the people who actually wrote out the words. They sat for hours, often in cold monasteries, carefully copying texts. Sometimes they copied religious books, sometimes ancient Greek or Roman philosophy, sometimes legal texts. It was painstaking work. They used quills, usually made from goose feathers, and ink they made themselves from soot, plant dyes, or iron galls. Every letter had to be perfect. One mistake could mean redoing a whole page or carefully scraping off the error with a knife and writing over it. It demanded intense focus and skill, and it wasn't just writing. Many of these books were also illuminated. This means they had beautiful, intricate illustrations, decorated capital letters, and borders painted with vibrant colors. Some of these colors came from rare minerals like lapis lazuli for blue, which had to be imported from far-off lands. Adding gold leaf was common too, making the pages literally shine. These illuminators were artists, and their work added even more time and cost to the book's creation. So when you add up the cost of the materials, the animal skins, the rare pigments, the gold pigments, and then the enormous amount of labor from the scribes and artists, you can see why a single book was incredibly expensive. It was an item of luxury, a symbol of wealth and power. It was like owning a modern-day supercar, a private jet, and a famous painting all rolled into one, but for information. Because of this, only certain people and institutions could afford books. Churches and monasteries were the biggest owners. They needed Bibles, prayer books, and texts for study. Universities, which started emerging in places like Oxford and Paris, also started building collections. Kings, queens, and very wealthy nobles might own a few, but they were mostly for display or personal devotion. These books held knowledge. They held stories, they held the wisdom of the past. In a world without widespread literacy, without mass media, these books were the reservoirs of learning. They were the internet, the universities, and the news channels all combined. And because they were so hard to get, so costly to make, and so important for the preservation of knowledge, they were treated with the utmost respect. They weren't just objects, they were treasures, sacred almost. They weren't meant to be taken lightly, or worse, stolen. And that's where the idea of chaining them comes in. It was a practical solution to a very real problem, how to let people use something so valuable without letting it disappear. With books being such precious objects, the places where they were kept also became very important. These weren't public libraries in the way we think of them today. They were specialized collections, often found within monasteries, cathedrals, or universities. These early libraries were built to serve a very specific group of people: scholars, monks, priests, and students. The idea of anyone just walking in and borrowing a book was completely foreign. Imagine a monastery library. It was usually a quiet, solemn place, often cold, designed for deep study and contemplation. The books there were essential for the religious life and scholarly work of the monks. They were used for daily services, for copying new texts, and for understanding religious doctrine. Losing one of these books could set back the monastery's work for years, or even lose a unique piece of knowledge forever. At universities, the situation was similar. Students and masters needed access to texts to learn and teach. But again, these books were rare. A university might have only a few copies of a crucial text, and those copies were often shared among many students. If a book went missing, a whole course of study could be disrupted. It wasn't like they could just order another one from Amazon. Replacements took years, money, and skilled labor. So the problem became clear: how do you make these incredibly valuable and rare books accessible to the people who need them, while also making sure they don't get lost, damaged, or stolen? You might think, why not just lock them up? And some libraries did keep their most precious books in chests or cupboards, often under lock and key. But that made them hard to use. The whole point of a library is to allow people to read and study the books. If they're always locked away, they're not really fulfilling their purpose. Another option might be to have a librarian constantly watching over everyone. But early libraries often didn't have dedicated full-time librarians in the modern sense. And even if they did, monitoring every single reader, making sure no one accidentally walked off with a book or intentionally tried to smuggle one out, would be an impossible task. Remember, people didn't have pockets full of gadgets back then, but they still had sticky fingers. The temptation to take such a valuable item, an item that could fetch a huge sum or provide immense personal prestige, was very real. Even if someone didn't intend to steal it, a book could be easily misplaced, loaned to a friend and forgotten, or simply walked out of the room by accident. So, people looked for a practical solution. They needed a system that allowed the books to be open and available for reading within the library space, but absolutely prevented them from being removed. And the simplest, most effective, and most obvious solution they came up with was chaining the books to the desks. It sounds a bit barbaric to us now, but it was actually a very innovative security system for its time. It was a clear statement: these books are here for you to use, but they must stay here. It showed the immense value placed on knowledge and the lengths people would go to protect it. It was a physical manifestation of trust, but with a firm boundary. The chains ensured that anyone using the book had to do so on the premises, right there at the desk. No accidental walk-offs, no intentional thefts. The knowledge was there, but it was fixed. And this system worked for centuries. Now let's talk about the actual setup. It wasn't just a haphazard chain thrown around a book. It was a carefully designed system built into the very furniture of the library. Imagine a large, heavy wooden reading desk or lectern. These weren't small, flimsy tables. They were built to last, often with sloping tops to make reading easier. Each desk would typically have several spots where books could be laid open. And attached to each spot was a metal ring, or bar. From that ring, a chain would run. These chains weren't tiny, delicate things. They were made of iron or brass, strong enough to withstand pulling and tampering. The length of the chain was crucial. It had to be long enough to allow the reader to pick up the book, turn its pages, and read it comfortably while it rested on the desk. But it also had to be short enough to absolutely prevent the book from being lifted off the desk and walked away with. You couldn't even put it under your arm. It kept the book tethered, a permanent fixture of that reading station. Now, how was the chain attached to the book itself? This is where the ingenuity comes in. They didn't just drill a hole through the precious pages. That would be unthinkable. Instead, the chain was usually attached to the cover of the book. Often, a metal staple or clasp was fixed to the wooden board of the book's binding, typically at the bottom corner. Then, a ring on the chain would be passed through the staple. The brilliant part was that the chain was usually attached to the bottom of the book. Why the bottom? So that when the book was opened and placed on the desk, the chain would hang underneath the lectern or desk. This meant the chain didn't get in the way of reading, it didn't snag pages or obstruct the text. It was out of sight, out of mind until you tried to move the book. These chained books weren't just randomly placed. They were often arranged in a specific order, just like books on a shelf today. The desks themselves were usually positioned at right angles to the windows, allowing natural light to fall directly onto the open pages. This was important because artificial lighting was either non-existent or very dim and expensive, like candles or oil lamps. Good light was essential for reading the often dense and small script of these old texts. Sometimes, the books were stored on shelves above the desks. When a scholar wanted to use a book, they would take it down, open it, and lay it on the desk. The chain would then extend from the shelf, allowing it to be read at the desk below. This setup meant that the books were still accessible and visible, but always remained connected to their designated reading spot. It was a very integrated system. This furniture, these reading desks and lecterns, were often custom made for the chained library. They weren't just any old tables. They were sturdy, often oak, pieces of craftsmanship designed to facilitate this specific method of study. You can still see some of these original desks in the few surviving chain libraries today, and they give you a real sense of the atmosphere and purpose of these places. Well, it wasn't just about theft, though that was a big part of it. It also prevented misplacement. Imagine a large collection of unique, hand-copied books. If someone could just pick up a book and move it to a different desk, or another room, finding it again could be a nightmare. The chains ensured that each book had its designated place. It was always there, always available, always secure. This order was vital for a functional library, especially when the cataloging systems were much simpler than what we have today. The chain was a literal and figurative link between the book and its location, making sure knowledge stayed accessible but also stayed put. It was a marvel of simple, effective engineering for its time. So, what did this chaining system mean for the people who used these libraries? Well, for one thing, it meant limited mobility. You couldn't just grab a book, wander off to a cozy armchair in another corner of the library, or take it outside to read in the garden. You had to read it right there, at that specific desk. But for scholars, monks, and students of the time, this wasn't necessarily a hardship. In fact, it was often the only way they would get to access such valuable knowledge at all. The trade-off was simple, a bit of inconvenience for access to essential texts. Most people were probably just grateful for the opportunity to read these rare books. Imagine the atmosphere in such a library. It would have been very quiet, very serious. People would be hunched over heavy tomes, carefully turning the pages, sometimes copying out passages by hand. There wouldn't be much movement or chatter. It was a place of deep concentration and rigorous study. The chains themselves would have made a subtle clinking sound as books were moved, a constant reminder of their value and the rules of the house. The effectiveness of the system was largely undeniable. It worked. Chained libraries had significantly fewer losses than libraries where books were freely accessible. It was a robust security measure for an age before advanced lock technology, security cameras, or even widespread literacy that would make books less valuable as individual items. The books stayed where they belonged, serving their purpose for generations, but the world began to change, slowly at first, then much faster. A pivotal moment in this change was the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century. Before this, every book was unique, copied by hand. After Gutenberg, books could be mass-produced. And I mean relatively mass-produced. A single printing press could make hundreds of copies of a book in the time it took a scribe to make one. This had huge implications. The cost of books started to go down dramatically. They were still expensive by modern standards, but nowhere near the astronomical sums of the handwritten era. More people could afford books, and more books meant a greater spread of knowledge. As books became less rare and less expensive, their individual value, while still significant, started to decrease. It was no longer a single, irreplaceable object. There might be other copies in other libraries, or even multiple copies within the same library. This gradual shift in value began to make the chaining system seem less necessary. Think about it from a practical standpoint, too. As the number of books in libraries grew because of printing, imagine chaining every single one. It would become a monumental, perhaps impossible, task. The sheer volume of chains, the cost of the metal, and the time spent attaching them would be overwhelming. The libraries needed new ways to manage their collections. So, the practice of chaining didn't stop overnight. It declined slowly, gradually falling out of favor over the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. The libraries began to explore different models of organization and security. Some moved to locked glass cases for valuable books, where they could still be seen but not touched without permission. Others developed rudimentary borrowing systems, relying on trust and records. The chaining of books was a reflection of its time. It showed a world where information was scarce, precious, and difficult to disseminate. It was a time when the physical book itself was almost as revered as the knowledge it contained. As books became more commonplace, the need for such extreme measures waned. The very idea of what a library was and who it served began to evolve. But for a long time, the chains were an essential part of keeping knowledge safe and available for those who needed it most. The printing press was really the beginning of the end for chained libraries. It was the game changer. Before Gutenberg, a book was a singular work of art, a unique piece. After, it was a reproducible item. This fundamental shift changed everything. First, books became cheaper. Mass production meant less labor per book, even if materials were still somewhat costly. A book that might have cost a small fortune for a hand-copied version could now be bought for a fraction of that price. When something becomes less expensive and more available, its individual perceived value changes. It's still valuable, but not chain it to the desk valuable. Second, the sheer volume of books exploded. Libraries started to grow at an unprecedented rate. Imagine trying to chain thousands, then tens of thousands of books. It would have been impractical, cumbersome, and incredibly expensive in terms of the metal chains and the specialized furniture needed. Librarians, who were becoming more common as a profession, needed more efficient ways to organize and store their growing collections. Third, the very purpose of libraries started to shift. While they remained centers of scholarship, there was a gradual move towards making knowledge more broadly accessible. The idea of a public library, though still centuries away from its modern form, started to germinate. As more people became literate and the demand for books grew, the restrictive nature of chained libraries began to seem outdated. So libraries gradually abandoned the practice. They moved towards different security measures. For truly rare or valuable books, they might be kept in locked cupboards or special rooms that only the librarian could access. For the general collection, libraries began to trust in new systems. They developed loan ledgers where readers would sign out a book, promising to return it. This was an early form of our modern borrowing system. The emphasis shifted from physically restraining the book to recording its movement and placing trust with accountability in the borrower. The decline of chained libraries also reflects a broader change in society's relationship with knowledge. It went from something held by a select few, guarded jealously, to something that was increasingly seen as a public good, something to be shared and disseminated widely. The printing press was a huge democratizer of knowledge, even if it took centuries for that full impact to be realized. Today, there are only a handful of chained libraries left in the world. They are mostly in England, like Hereford Cathedral, and in some other parts of Europe. These aren't working libraries anymore. They are historical artifacts. They are preserved because they are unique windows into a past way of life, a past way of managing information. When you visit one of these surviving libraries, you get a palpable sense of history. You see the worn wooden desks, the thick, heavy books, and the actual chains. It's a reminder of just how much things have changed. It shows us the immense reverence people once had for the physical book. It shows us the challenges of preserving knowledge in an age without advanced technology. And it makes you think about our own relationship with information today. We have more access to books and information than anyone in history could have ever dreamed of. It's on our phones, on our computers, and digital libraries. We don't worry about chaining books anymore. Our challenges are different: how to navigate the vast ocean of information, how to discern truth from falsehood, how to stay focused in a world of constant digital distraction. But the chain libraries stand as a testament to the enduring value of books and knowledge. They remind us that even if the methods change, the fundamental human desire to learn, to preserve, and to share wisdom remains constant. They were a practical, ingenious solution for a particular time, and they tell a fascinating story about the journey of books and libraries through history.